1 billion liters. That was the daily volume of fresh water surging into the city of Rome by the 2nd century AD, enough to provide every citizen with nearly twice the water consumption of a modern New Yorker. Across the Eurasian landmass, another empire measured its success not in liters of luxury, but in the millions of cubic meters of silt held back by the sweat of a million peasants. How did two civilizations, separated by thousands of miles of Silk Road and mountain, arrive at such radically different methods of mastering the natural world? The Roman engineer began his work with a survey of the landscape, seeking the purity of mountain springs far removed from the urban grime. He did not settle for the brackish, sluggish Tiber flowing beneath the city's 7 hills. Instead, he reached out 20, 40, or even 80 kilometers into the wilderness to claim the very essence of life. This was a statement of total dominance over geography, a process of turning gravity into a permanent servant of the Roman state. 7,000 kilometers to the east, the engineers of the Han and Qin dynasties faced a far more volatile and terrifying master. The Yellow River carried enough sediment to raise its own bed above the surrounding plains, creating a suspended ocean of mud that loomed over the heart of the empire. Here, nature was not a resource to be tapped for the comfort of the elite, but a chaotic force that had to be shackled for the survival of the species. The failure of a single levee meant the death of an entire province and the potential collapse of a dynasty's mandate. For the Roman, water was the medium of civilization, fueling the fountains, the public latrines, and the heated floors of the wealthy. It was an engineering of convenience that evolved into an engineering of identity, where being Roman meant having access to the clear, cold streams of the Apennines. It was a lifestyle defined by the artificial abundance of a resource that was once scarce. The aqueduct was the umbilical cord that allowed the city to grow beyond its natural limits, creating a marble oasis in a dry Mediterranean world. For the Chinese, the river was the pulse of the empire, a provider of fertile less that also threatened to drown the very people it fed. Management was not about the individual's pleasure or the aesthetics of a fountain, but about the collective's continuity against the threat of annihilation. The state was born from the mud of these floodplains, necessitated by the need for a singular, absolute authority to coordinate the movement of Earth. 1 million men could be summoned by a single decree to build a wall against the water, a feat of mobilization that the Mediterranean world could scarcely imagine. Look closely at the materials chosen by these two giants. Rome used stone, volcanic pozzolana concrete, and lead to create permanent monuments to their technical prowess. These structures were designed to last for centuries, standing as silent, arched sentinels of a peaceful, urbanized existence. They were the skeletal remains of a dream where nature had been thoroughly domesticated and invited into the home. China, conversely, used the earth itself, weaving straw, wood, and packed soil into massive embankments that stretched for hundreds of miles. These were not monuments of permanence, but battlefronts in an eternal, grinding war. Every season brought a new assault from the silt-heavy waters, and every year required a new mobilization of the masses to repair what the river had torn. The engineering was a living, breathing process of constant vigilance and human sacrifice. In the Mediterranean, the aqueduct allowed for the growth of megacities that could effectively ignore their local environmental constraints. Rome could swell to a population of 1 million souls because the water came to them from the mountains. This fostered an urban culture where the state provided for the physical well-being of its citizens as a basic right of residency. It was a civilization built on the premise that technology could liberate the individual from the drudgery of the landscape. In the central plain of China, the river dictated the social hierarchy and the very nature of power. The emperor was the supreme hydraulic engineer, the one individual tasked with balancing the heavens and the earth. If the river breached, it was not merely a technical failure. It was a sign that the emperor had lost his spiritual contract with the universe. This created a culture of extreme discipline, where survival was a team sport and the individual was always secondary to the integrity of the dike. The Roman surveyor used a groma, a simple cross-shaped tool, to plot straight lines and right angles across the landscape. He looked for the most efficient route for his stone artery, cutting through mountains and bridging valleys with mathematical precision. He was an artist of the straight line, imposing a human logic onto a curved and jagged world. His goal was to make the water disappear into pipes and tunnels until it reappeared as a controlled spray in a public square. The Chinese official used the collective memory of 1,000 years of disasters to guide his hand. He did not seek to change the river's path so much as he sought to contain its fury and prevent it from wandering across the plains. He understood that the river was a dragon that wanted to move, and his job was to deny that movement through the sheer mass of human will. He was a guardian of the boundary between the fertile field and the watery abyss. The psychological weight of a Roman fountain was a display of magnificent excess. It was a statement that the empire had so much power it could afford to let water spill onto the pavement for the sake of beauty and sound. It whispered to the passerby that the world was under control and the gods had been invited into the city to stay. The fountain was the ultimate symbol of a nature that had been conquered and turned into a toy. Contrast this with the heavy silence of a Chinese village tucked behind a massive levee. There is no beauty in the wall of dirt, only the grim reality of what it keeps at bay. The power here is not displayed in a fountain, but in the absence of a flood, a peace that is the sound of a river staying within its banks. It is a fragile, hard-won victory that must be re-earned every single morning by the people who live in its shadow. These two paths to mastery represent the fundamental divide in how humans interact with the planet. One path seeks to enhance the quality of life through the clever application of physics and permanent infrastructure. The other path seeks to ensure the survival of the collective through the massive, coordinated application of human labor. Both achieved wonders that still stand today, but they did so by asking very different things of their people and their land. The Roman path led to the marble bathhouse, a sanctuary of steam and socialization where the elite could forget the world outside. The Chinese path led to the imperial throne, a seat of power that was only as stable as the embankments on the Yellow River. One was an architecture of invitation, the other an architecture of defense. To understand how these paths were built, we must first look at the specific stones and the specific hands that laid them. The Roman dream of water began with a single, calculated drop of rain falling in the mountains, destined for a golden goblet. But before that water could reach the city, it had to be captured by a design so perfect that it defied the very terrain it crossed. Chapter 2. The Roman Blueprint: Engineering for Urban Luxury. Imagine a city where the sound of rushing water is as constant as the heartbeat of its people. In the narrow, sun-drenched alleys of the Suburra and across the wide, gleaming plazas of the Forum, the gurgle of fountains provided a rhythmic backdrop to imperial life. This was not the stagnant water of a stone cistern or the muddy, unpredictable flow of a riverbank, but a crystal-clear mountain stream brought directly to the doorstep of the urbanite. To the Roman mind, a city without an endless supply of fresh water was merely a cluster of huts. Urbanity was defined by the ability to transcend the limitations of the local environment through sheer engineering will. While other ancient capitals huddled around rivers and lakes for survival, Rome reached out its long stone fingers to grasp the springs of the distant Apennine hills. This transformation began as a matter of necessity, but rapidly evolved into the ultimate expression of state-sponsored luxury. By the time of the late Republic, the Roman blueprint for a city required more than just defensive walls and temples to the gods. It demanded a complex subterranean and aerial network designed specifically to provide for the physical pleasure and comfort of its inhabitants. The Roman citizen expected the state to provide what we might now consider a basic human right, but what was then a miracle of technology. They did not just want to survive the summer heat. They wanted to bathe, to socialize in steam, and to see the wealth of the empire reflected in every public square. This culture of abundance was a deliberate political tool used by the Caesars to ensure the loyalty of the city's volatile population. Consider the sheer scale of the great baths, or thermae, which stood as the cathedrals of this water-obsessed culture. These were not merely places to wash away the grime of the day, but vast complexes of marble, mosaic, and light. Within their walls, a common laborer could experience a level of opulence that would have been the envy of a foreign king in any other land. Hot rooms, cold plunges, and steam-filled chambers were all made possible by a constant, unceasing flow of mountain water that never stopped. This required an engineering vision that looked far beyond the immediate needs of agriculture or drinking. It was an architecture of the senses, where the temperature and movement of water were controlled with the same precision as a legion's march. The blueprint for this luxury was laid out in the offices of the curator aquarum, the high-ranking official responsible for the city's veins. This man managed a small army of specialized slaves, architects, and inspectors who ensured the arteries of the city never ran dry. It was a bureaucracy of flow, where every gallon was accounted for and redirected to where it could best serve the imperial image. For the wealthy elite living in palatial villas on the Palatine Hill, the luxury was even more intimate and profound. They paid the state for the privilege of private lead pipes, known as fistulae, which brought water directly into their enclosed gardens. Here, the sound of a private fountain was the ultimate status symbol, a quiet whisper of power that set the owner apart from the noise of the street. Yet even the poorest citizen in the crowded, multi-story insulae apartments had access to the thousands of public basins scattered throughout the city. These fountains were the social hubs of the neighborhood, places where women gathered to fill jars and men paused to drink in the shade. This accessibility was a cornerstone of the Roman social contract, a promise that the fruits of conquest were shared by every person who called themselves a Roman. The engineering was so successful that it created a fundamental psychological shift in how the population viewed the natural world. Nature was no longer a fickle deity to be feared or a wild beast to be avoided at all costs. It was a raw material to be harvested, refined, and delivered in a standardized, predictable format for the sake of human convenience. This mindset allowed for the creation of an urban lifestyle that was remarkably modern in its comforts and its expectations. The Romans invented the idea of the amenity, a service provided by the state that improved the quality of life beyond mere subsistence. In doing so, they created a blueprint for every Western city that would follow in their footsteps for the next 2,000 years. However, this luxury was not just about the water coming into the city. It was also about where it went after it had served its purpose. The constant, purposeful overflow from the public fountains was directed into the massive drainage tunnels of the Cloaca Maxima. This continuous flushing of the city's waste was a stroke of unintended genius that kept the metropolis from choking on its own growth. Luxury and sanitation became two sides of the same coin, forged in the fires of Roman pragmatism and ego. By using the continuous overflow from the city's fountains and baths to flush the streets and sewers, the engineers created a sustainable urban ecosystem. It was a masterpiece of planning that allowed 1 million people to live in close quarters without the constant threat of waterborne plague. The Roman blueprint was also a statement of permanence in a world defined by cycles of drought and decay. While the rivers of the East might flood and recede with the seasons, the Roman aqueduct provided a steady, unwavering pulse of life. This reliability gave the Roman people a sense of security and a belief in the eternal, unchanging nature of their empire. They built not just for the next harvest, but for the next century, using materials that could withstand the ravages of time and weather. The stone arches that marched across the plains were the physical manifestation of this supreme confidence. They were the skeletal structure of a civilization that believed it had finally solved the problem of human existence through stone and water. Every province that Rome conquered was eventually gifted with this same blueprint of stone, lead, and flowing water. From the deserts of North Africa to the rainy forests of Britain, the Roman bathhouse and fountain followed the path of the legionary sword. It was a standardized package of civilization, a way of making the entire known world feel like a comfortable suburb of the capital. To live as a Roman was to live with the luxury of choice, enabled by the total mastery of the surrounding landscape. One could choose to spend the afternoon in the library of a bath complex or watching the spray of a monumental nymphaeum. This was the Pax Romana expressed through plumbing, a peace that was bought with the blood of soldiers and maintained by the skill of architects. But this dream of endless luxury rested on a foundation of incredible mathematical complexity and grueling physical labor. The water did not simply arrive by magic. It was coaxed, channeled, and forced through obstacles that would have broken a lesser people. The true magic of the Roman blueprint lay in its ability to hide this immense struggle behind a facade of effortless marble and cool, splashing spray. Behind the steaming pools and the ornate fountains lay a world of hidden calculations and grueling construction beneath the earth. To understand the soul of this urban paradise, we must look beneath the surface of the polished marble. We must examine the invisible, unrelenting force that turned a mountain spring into a city's lifeblood. But how did these ancient architects move mountains of water using nothing but the silent pull of the earth itself? The answer lay in a single, terrifyingly precise measurement that would change the world forever. Chapter 3. Gravity and Stone, the technical marvel of the aqueducts. The secret to the Roman miracle was not power, but a slope so gentle it was nearly invisible to the naked eye. To move water across 50 miles of rugged terrain, the engineer had to maintain a gradient of perhaps 1 meter for every 500 meters of travel. This was a calculation of terrifying precision, where a single mistake of a few centimeters could result in a stagnant pool or a destructive torrent. The Roman surveyor did not have lasers or satellites, but he possessed a relentless patience and a tool known as the chorobates. The chorobates was a massive wooden bench, 20 feet long, with a groove carved into its top to hold water. By observing the water level in this trough, the surveyor could determine a perfectly horizontal line against the horizon. From this baseline, he would calculate the minute drop required to keep the water moving forward under the constant, invisible hand of gravity. It was a slow, methodical dance between man and the earth, performed one 20-foot stretch at a time across mountains and marshes. Accompanying the chorobates was the groma, which allowed the engineer to maintain strict geometric alignment. These tools were the eyes of the empire, allowing the Romans to impose a grid of logic upon the chaotic geography of the Mediterranean. They did not follow the winding paths of least resistance like a natural stream. Instead, they forced the landscape to submit to the straight line, cutting through hills and bridging valleys to maintain the purity of the flow. While the iconic arches are what remain in our collective memory, the vast majority of a Roman aqueduct lived in the darkness beneath the earth. Roughly 80% of the network was comprised of subterranean tunnels, hand-carved into the living rock or buried just beneath the surface. This was a strategic choice, protecting the water from the heat of the sun, the risk of evaporation, and the threat of enemy sabotage. The underground was the silent heart of the system, a labyrinthine artery that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. To dig these tunnels, Roman engineers utilized a system of vertical shafts known as puttae, spaced at regular intervals along the route. These shafts allowed multiple crews of slaves and laborers to work simultaneously, digging outward in both directions from the bottom of each hole. It was a feat of coordination that required perfect alignment. If the two teams digging toward each other missed their mark by even a foot, the entire section was ruined. The poutet also served as the lungs of the aqueduct, providing air to the workers and a way to hoist out the tons of excavated debris. When the workers encountered particularly hard rock, they turned to the ancient and brutal technique of fire setting. They would build massive, roaring fires against the rock face until the stone glowed with a dull internal heat. Then, they would suddenly douse the hot rock with cold water or vinegar, causing the stone to shatter under the violent thermal shock. In the cramped, smoke-filled tunnels, men breathed in the dust of centuries as they picked away at the fractured remains to clear a path for the water. Once the channel was carved, it had to be made watertight with a specialized lining known as opus signum. This was a sophisticated mortar made from lime, sand, and crushed pottery or tiles, which created a hydraulic cement that hardened even in the presence of moisture. The workers would meticulously smooth this pinkish plaster over the interior walls, creating a surface as slick as glass. This lining was the final barrier between the precious mountain spring and the porous earth that sought to reclaim it. The Romans also understood the chemistry of their environment, utilizing the volcanic ash of the Apennines to create a concrete that was virtually indestructible. This pozzolana concrete allowed them to build structures that could withstand the weight of millions of gallons of moving water for centuries. Unlike modern concrete, which often degrades within decades, the Roman mixture grew stronger over time as it reacted with the minerals in the water. It was a material born of the earth's fire, repurposed to serve the city's thirst. As the aqueduct neared the city or crossed a deep depression, the water finally emerged from the earth and onto the magnificent arched bridges. These structures were not built for aesthetic beauty, though they achieved it, but for the cold efficiency of physics. The arch allowed the Romans to span massive distances while using a fraction of the stone required for a solid wall. It also allowed the wind to pass through the structure, preventing the massive stone arteries from being toppled by the fierce Mediterranean gales. The weight of the water and the stone was distributed downward through the piers and into the bedrock, creating a stable platform that could soar hundreds of feet above a valley floor. At the Pont du Gard in Gaul, the 3 tiers of arches stand as a testament to this mastery of load-bearing geometry. Each stone was cut with such precision that they often required no mortar to stay in place, held together by the sheer force of gravity and the logic of the design. The arch was the Roman signature, a curve that conquered the void. In cases where a valley was too deep for even the tallest arches, the engineers employed the principle of the inverted siphon. They would transition the water from an open stone channel into a series of sealed lead pipes that plunged down one side of the valley and up the other. Using the pressure generated by the drop, the water would naturally seek its own level, rising up the opposite slope to continue its journey. This was a dangerous and expensive solution, requiring thousands of tons of lead and a perfect seal to prevent the pipes from bursting under the immense pressure. The production of these lead pipes, or fistulae, was an industry unto itself, requiring a massive mining operation that stretched from Spain to Britain. Sheets of lead were rolled into cylinders and soldered shut with a thick seam, then stamped with the name of the emperor or the official in charge. This was the high-tech plumbing of the ancient world, a network of metal veins that could withstand pressures that would have crushed a stone channel. It was a testament to the Roman ability to mobilize industrial-scale resources for a single engineering goal. Before the water reached the city gates, it passed through a series of settling tanks known as piscinae. Here, the flow slowed down, allowing the sand, silt, and pebbles carried from the mountains to drop to the bottom of the tank. This was a crucial stage of purification, ensuring that the water arriving at the public fountains was as clear as the spring it came from. The Romans were obsessed with the quality of their water, often grading different aqueducts for different uses based on their mineral content and clarity. Despite this filtration, the water of the Apennines was heavy with calcium carbonate, which slowly built up a thick crust of limestone inside the channels. This substance, known as sinter, would eventually choke the flow of the aqueduct if left unchecked. A permanent workforce of specialized slaves, the aquarii, spent their lives scraping this white stone from the walls of the tunnels. They were the janitors of the empire's veins, working in the dark to ensure the city above never felt the sting of a drought. The final destination for the water was a castellum aquae, a massive distribution hub that acted as a giant pressure valve and a sorting center. This stone fortress divided the incoming flow into three distinct categories. One portion was reserved for the public fountains, another for the great imperial baths, and the final portion for the private homes of the elite. This hierarchy of water was built into the very masonry of the hub, ensuring that even in times of shortage, the public basins never ran dry. This technical marvel created a sense of psychological invincibility among the Roman people. They lived in a world where the most basic of natural needs had been solved by the application of stone and mathematics. The mountain had been brought to the city, and the city had become a paradise of artificial abundance. They did not fear the sky or the river, for their water came from a source that seemed as eternal as the gods themselves. To the Roman, the aqueduct was the ultimate proof of their right to rule the world. It was a machine that functioned with the regularity of the cosmos, a silent servant that required only the occasional cleaning to provide for 1,000,000 souls. They had built a civilization that was detached from the immediate whims of the local climate. While the rest of the world prayed for rain, the Romans simply turned a tap and watched the mountains pour into their marble basins. But this mastery of the static landscape was a luxury afforded by the relatively stable environment of the Mediterranean. They were building against the stillness of the hills and the predictable flow of springs. Far to the east, another empire was attempting a feat of engineering that was not about the gentle guidance of a spring, but the violent containment of a monster. The Chinese engineers were not looking for the clarity of a mountain stream. They were staring into the churning, yellow heart of a river that could swallow a province in a single night. The Roman surveyor looked at the horizon and saw a line to be mastered, but the Chinese official looked at the horizon and saw a tide that had to be broken. The dragon was waking up, and no amount of stone or lead would be enough to hold it back. Chapter 4. The Symbol of Civilization. Water as a Public Right. A Roman woman named Claudia pauses at the base of a limestone basin, the morning sun catching the spray of the Aqua Virgo as it spills into the street. She does not pay a copper coin for this water, nor does she ask permission to fill her heavy terracotta jar to the brim. In the heart of the capital, the very concept of thirst has been abolished by the state through a massive, unceasing investment in the public good. This is the ultimate expression of Roman citizenship, the right to life-sustaining resources provided directly by the hand of the emperor. The public fountain was the true forum of the common people, a place where the social classes momentarily blurred under the sound of rushing water. While the rich had their private lead pipes and the senators enjoyed their heated marble baths, the street-side basin belonged to every soul within the city walls. There were nearly 600 of these reservoirs scattered across Rome, ensuring that no citizen was more than a few minutes' walk from a fresh supply. This was not merely a convenience of urban planning, it was a calculated strategy of social management. By making water a public right, the Roman state achieved a level of stability that was the envy of the ancient world. A well-fed and well-hydrated population is a population that rarely finds the energy to revolt against its masters. The emperors understood that the loyalty of the urban mob was bought not just with bread and circuses, but with the cool, constant flow of the mountains. To provide water was to provide the very essence of civilization, a gift that reinforced the legitimacy of the imperial office every single day. This philosophy transformed the city from a collection of residents into a unified body of consumers. The water did not just sustain the physical body, it cleaned the metaphorical soul of the city, washing away the stench of poverty and disease. In the eyes of a Roman, a city that could not provide for the hygiene of its poorest members was a city destined for ruin. This belief led to a massive public investment in infrastructure that had no immediate financial return, yet paid dividends in political longevity. The distribution of this resource was governed by a strict legal framework that prioritized the public good over private profit. When the mountain springs ran low during a particularly dry summer, the first pipes to be cut were those leading to the private gardens of the wealthy. The public basins and the great communal baths were the last to go dry, protected by a mandate that placed the collective needs of the city above the luxury of the elite. It was a rare instance of ancient egalitarianism, enforced by the heavy hand of the water commissioner and his staff. This management of resources created a unique urban psychology, where the individual felt entitled to the fruits of the natural world. The Roman did not look at the sky with desperation, wondering if the rains would come to fill a stagnant well. He looked at the stone arches on the horizon with absolute confidence, knowing that the state had already mastered the elements on his behalf. This sense of security allowed for an explosion of art, commerce, and leisure that defined the height of the Pax Romana. The monumental fountains, known as nymphaea, served as the visual anchors of this public rite. These were not simple taps, but grand architectural stages decorated with statues of gods, sea monsters, and heroes. They were designed to overwhelm the senses, reminding the passerby of the sheer power required to bring a river into the city. Every splashing drop was a testament to the fact that Rome had conquered nature and was now sharing the spoils with its people. Beyond the aesthetics, the constant flow of water served a vital sanitary function that was unique to the Roman world. Because the aqueducts never stopped running, the excess water from the fountains was diverted to flush the public latrines and the massive underground sewers. This continuous cleansing prevented the buildup of waste that turned other ancient cities into breeding grounds for plague. The public right to water was, in practice, a public right to health and a longer life. Marcus Agrippa, the man who first organized the city's water office, viewed this work as his greatest legacy to the Roman people. He spent his own vast fortune to repair old channels and build new ones, ensuring that the water reached even the most crowded insulae apartments. He understood that the greatness of an empire was measured not just by the territory it conquered, but by the quality of life it could guarantee its citizens. Under his guidance, the aqueduct became the umbilical cord of the Roman identity. This culture of abundance created a society that was fundamentally different from its neighbors. In the Greek city-states, water was often a precious commodity to be guarded and rationed within the walls of a fortress. In the Roman world, it was a boundless river that flowed through the streets, inviting the world to come and drink. This openness was a reflection of Rome's own expansive nature, a civilization that grew by absorbing and providing for those it brought into its fold. However, this public right carried a hidden cost that few citizens bothered to calculate in their daily lives. The maintenance of this artificial paradise required a constant influx of wealth from conquered provinces and the labor of thousands of specialized slaves. The water was free for the citizen, but it was paid for in the blood of legionaries and the sweat of the disenfranchised. It was a civilization built on the premise that the environment could be permanently subsidized through the expansion of military power. This Roman dream was a dream of total mastery, where the state acted as a provider of comfort and a guardian of individual dignity. They created a world where the person was shielded from the harshness of the earth by a layer of stone, lead, and law. But this shield was only as strong as the empire that supported it, and the mountains were far away. While Rome celebrated its fountains, another civilization was facing a far more brutal reality. Contrast this Mediterranean luxury with the landscape of the Far East, where water was never viewed as a gift to be enjoyed. In the valleys of the Yellow River, there was no room for the luxury of a public fountain or the leisure of a steam bath. Here, the relationship with water was not one of entitlement, but of eternal, crushing obligation to the group. The state did not offer the river as a public right. It demanded the public's life as a sacrifice to keep the river at bay. While the Roman engineer sought to bring the water in to serve the city, the Chinese engineer spent his life trying to keep the water out to save the nation. The arches of the Apennines spoke of a nature that had been invited to stay, but the earthen walls of the central plain spoke of a nature that was being held at gunpoint. One civilization found its identity in the splashing spray of a public square, while the other found it in the silent, terrifying height of a levee. While Rome's legacy was cemented in its public baths, China's destiny was forged in the relentless mobilization of its peasantry along the muddy banks of the North China Plain. There, the water does not flow through lead pipes, but crashes over the banks with the weight of 1,000 years of history. The impending struggle against the river would demand an unprecedented scale of human sacrifice, setting the stage for a battle where millions of lives hung in the balance. Chapter 5. China's Eternal Challenge, the Erratic Yellow River. Leave behind the sun-drenched marble of the Mediterranean and the gentle, calculated slopes of the Roman hills. To the east, across the vast expanse of the Eurasian landmass, the relationship between man and water takes on a far more primal and terrifying character. Here, in the heart of the North China Plain, there is no room for the luxury of a decorative fountain or the leisure of a public bath. Instead, there is a river that carries the weight of a civilization's survival and the constant, looming threat of its total annihilation. The Yellow River, or the Huanghe, is a force of nature that defies the logic of European hydrology. It is not merely a body of water, but a thick, churning slurry of liquid earth that has carved the destiny of the Chinese people for 5,000 years. While the Romans sought to master the clarity of a mountain spring, the Chinese were locked in a desperate, eternal struggle with a dragon made of mud. This river is known as the Mother River, the cradle of their culture, but it also carries a more chilling name, China's Sorrow. The story of this erratic titan begins in the high, wind-swept reaches of the Loess Plateau, a landscape of ancient dust and fragile canyons. For millennia, the winds of the Gobi Desert have deposited a fine yellow silt known as loess across this region, creating a soil that is as fertile as it is unstable. This soil is so fine that it feels like flour between the fingers, and it possesses a structural weakness that makes it incredibly susceptible to erosion. When the seasonal rains strike the plateau, the earth simply dissolves, turning the clear mountain streams into a thick, ochre-colored torrent. As the river descends from the highlands, it picks up a staggering volume of this sediment, carrying hundreds of millions of tons of silt every year, enough to constantly reshape the landscape and choke its own channel. In some sections, the water is so saturated with earth that it is more than 40% solid matter by weight. This is the fundamental challenge that has defined Chinese engineering since the dawn of time. The river is not just moving water, it is moving a mountain, piece by piece, from the heart of the continent toward the sea. When this heavy, silt-laden flow reaches the flat expanse of the North China Plain, the physics of the river change with catastrophic results. The current slows down, and the river no longer has the energy to carry its massive burden of yellow earth. The silt begins to settle, falling to the bottom of the channel and slowly raising the level of the riverbed. Over decades and centuries, this process creates a geological phenomenon that is as awe-inspiring as it is terrifying: the suspended river. In many parts of the North China Plain, the bed of the Yellow River actually sits dozens of feet above the surrounding countryside. The people living in the villages and cities along its banks look up, not down, at the water that sustains them. They are separated from a watery grave only by massive, man-made earthen levees that must be constantly raised to keep pace with the rising silt. It is a vertical arms race between human labor and geological deposition, a battle where the river never stops climbing. This precarious arrangement creates a psychological landscape of constant, low-level dread that is entirely foreign to the Roman experience. For a citizen of Rome, the failure of an aqueduct meant a temporary shortage of water for the baths or the fountains. For a Chinese farmer, a breach in the levee meant the sudden, violent erasure of his entire world. A single crack in the earthwork could unleash a wall of mud and water that would travel for hundreds of miles, burying entire provinces under a layer of suffocating yellow silt. The scale of these disasters is almost impossible to comprehend through the lens of modern Western history. Throughout the centuries, the Yellow River has claimed the lives of millions in single, cataclysmic events that dwarf the casualties of the greatest wars. When the river breaks its banks, it does not just flood, it reclaims the land, turning fertile fields into a stagnant, muddy wasteland that can take years to recover. This is the eternal challenge of the Chinese state, to hold back a tide that is constantly seeking a new path to the sea. Unlike the Roman aqueducts, which followed a fixed and permanent path of stone, the Yellow River is a wandering ghost. It is famously erratic, having changed its entire course multiple times throughout recorded history. At various points, the mouth of the river has swung from the north of the Shandong Peninsula to the south, a distance of nearly 500 miles. These shifts are not gradual. They are violent pivots that can happen in the space of a few weeks, leaving old cities stranded in the dust and drowning new ones in the mud. This unpredictability forced a different kind of engineering philosophy upon the Chinese people. While the Romans built for permanence and aesthetic perfection, the Chinese built for resilience and mass mobilization. Their levees were not made of dressed stone and hydraulic cement, but of rammed earth, straw, and the collective sweat of millions of laborers. It was a technology of scale rather than a technology of precision. They did not try to bypass the river's power, they tried to contain it through the sheer weight of human numbers. The management of the Yellow River became the primary metric by which a Chinese ruler's legitimacy was measured. This reinforced the mandate of heaven, a political philosophy that linked the morality of the emperor to the stability of the natural world. If the levees held and the harvests were bountiful, it was a sign that the heavens approved of the ruling dynasty. But if the river broke and the people drowned, it was proof that the emperor had lost his divine right to rule, signaling the end of an era. This created a unique form of governance that historians often call the hydraulic state. To survive the Yellow River, China had to become the most organized and centralized society on Earth. No single village or province could hope to manage the river on its own. A breach in the north could lead to a flood in the south. It required a national effort, a unified command that could mobilize hundreds of thousands of people at a moment's notice to repair a dike or dredge a channel. The individual was secondary to the survival of the collective, a stark contrast to the Roman focus on individual urban amenities. In Rome, water was a service provided to the citizen to enhance his life and status. In China, water was a monster that required the citizen to sacrifice his labor, his time, and sometimes his life to keep it at bay. The engineering of the Yellow River was not about the pursuit of luxury, but the avoidance of total collapse. Consider the sheer physical labor involved in maintaining these thousands of miles of earthen walls. Every spring and autumn, the peasantry was called away from their fields to work on the levees. They moved millions of tons of earth by hand, using nothing but woven baskets and wooden shovels. This was a form of national service that was as rigorous and demanding as any military campaign. The Great Wall of China is often cited as the pinnacle of their labor, but the levees of the Yellow River required far more earth and far more lives to maintain. The river also dictated the very structure of Chinese agriculture and social organization. Because the floods were so frequent and so devastating, the people developed a culture of intense cooperation and shared responsibility. Wealth was not measured by the private access to water, as it was in Rome, but by the collective security of the community. A man's survival depended entirely on the strength of his neighbor's section of the levee, creating a social bond forged in the mud of the riverbank. This environmental pressure also drove the development of unique Chinese technologies, such as the use of fascines, large bundles of brushwood and stone used to plug gaps in the dikes. They learned to read the river's moods, observing the color of the silt and the speed of the current to predict an impending breach. It was a science of observation and adaptation, honed over thousands of years of trial and error. They did not seek to solve the river, for they knew the river could never be truly solved. They only sought to survive it for one more season. The contrast between the two civilizations is most visible in their ruins. The Roman aqueduct stands as a skeletal monument to a vanished luxury, its stone arches still marking the path of a mountain spring. The Chinese levee, however, is a living, breathing part of the landscape, a massive earthen scar that is still being tended to this very day. One represents a moment of supreme confidence and static mastery, while the other represents an ongoing, dynamic battle that has no end in sight. As we look at the churning yellow waters of the Huanghe, we see a different kind of human greatness. It is not the greatness of the architect who designs a perfect arch, but the greatness of a people who refuse to be swept away by the tide. It is the story of a civilization that was hammered into shape by the very river that sought to destroy it. The erratic nature of the water forced the creation of a state that was as rigid and unyielding as the levees themselves. But to maintain this wall against the water, the state would need more than just mud and straw. It would need a system of power so absolute that it could command the very breath of its subjects. The dragon was contained for now, but the price of its silence was the complete surrender of the individual to the will of the center. Chapter 6. The Hydraulic State. Centralized Power and Mass Labor. An official stands on a wooden platform, his silk robes fluttering in the damp wind that rises from the yellow silt. In his hand, he holds a scroll marked with the imperial seal, a document that carries the weight of 1,000 villages. He is not a general or a priest, but a river administrator, the most vital cog in the machinery of the empire. For him, the river is not a scenic vista, but a mathematical equation of life and death that must be balanced every single hour. This is the birth of the hydraulic state, a political organism where power flows as surely as the water itself. To manage a river that spans a continent, the Chinese soul had to forge a system of absolute, centralized authority. There could be no debate between local lords and no hesitation in the face of a rising tide. A single breach in a northern province would drown a southern one, making unity not a choice, but a biological necessity for survival. The emperor sat at the apex of this pyramid, his primary duty being the maintenance of the cosmic and terrestrial balance. Beneath him stretched a vast bureaucracy of water officials, engineers, and surveyors who mapped every curve of the levee. They were the eyes of the state, reporting the slightest seep of moisture or the shift of a sandbar back to the capital. This was a government built on the observation of mud, where the height of a riverbed determined the fate of a dynasty. The true engine of this state, however, was the corvée system, a relentless tax of human labor that every able-bodied man was required to pay. When the drum sounded in the village square, the farmer laid down his plow and picked up a wicker basket and a wooden spade. He was not being drafted into an army to fight a human foe, but into a labor corps to face the river. For months at a time, he would live in a world of damp earth and biting cold, his individuality swallowed by the collective task. The scale of these mobilizations was staggering, often involving hundreds of thousands of men working in a single synchronized effort. From the perspective of a bird, the riverbanks would have looked like a swarming nest of ants, moving millions of tons of earth by hand. They did not have the Roman luxury of specialized stone-cutting tools or volcanic cement. They had only their numbers, their discipline, and the terrifying knowledge of what would happen if they failed to finish before the rains. To sustain such a massive workforce, the state developed a logistical network that was unparalleled in the ancient world. Great grain barges moved along the canals, carrying the lifeblood of the empire to the work camps on the front lines of the flood. Thousands of cooks prepared simple meals of millet and salted vegetables in massive iron cauldrons that never went cold. This was the first industrial-scale operation in history, managed not for profit, but for the basic preservation of the soil. This mobilization created a culture where the individual was secondary to the survival of the group. In the Roman world, a citizen might take pride in the beauty of a public fountain or the warmth of a bathhouse. In China, pride was found in the height and thickness of the levee that protected one's ancestral graves. The state did not promise luxury. It promised a tomorrow where your children would not be swept away by the mud. This absolute power was a double-edged sword that cut deep into the fabric of Chinese society. The same authority that could save 1 million people from a flood could also be used to crush any hint of dissent or local autonomy. Because the river required a unified command, the state became a monolith that tolerated no rivals to its power. The engineering of the water became the engineering of the people, molding them into a force as predictable and manageable as a dredged channel. The Roman engineer worked with stone to create a permanent monument to human ingenuity and urban comfort. The Chinese administrator worked with human lives to create a temporary barrier against a relentless and shifting natural enemy. One built for the glory of the city, while the other built for the survival of the species. It was a divergence of philosophy that would define the two ends of the world for the next 2,000 years. But this system of total control relied on a fragile promise, that the state would always be stronger than the river. If the corruption of the court led to neglected levees, or if the rains grew too heavy for the earthworks, the mandate would shatter. The very power that held the empire together would become the instrument of its spectacular and violent downfall. The dragon was not just in the water, it was in the heart of the government itself. The levees were high, and the people were weary, but the water was still rising. A single man's exhaustion was about to become a nation's catastrophe. Chapter 7. A Battle for Survival. Sacrificing for the collective good. The sky above the North China Plain turns the color of bruised iron as the late summer monsoons arrive with a primal fury. In the great city of Kaifeng, the air is so thick with humidity that every breath feels like a struggle against the river itself. The elders watch the markers on the stone pillars, seeing the yellow water creep upward, inch by agonizing inch, toward the lip of the embankment. This is not a time for the Roman luxury of prayer or the quiet contemplation of philosophy, but for the brutal physical labor of survival. Lao Chen, a man whose skin is as weathered and cracked as the loose soil he tilled, grips the handle of a wooden shovel until his knuckles turn white. He has spent 40 years defending this particular stretch of the earthen wall, a barrier that separates his family from a sudden, watery grave. Behind him, the village is silent. The women and children already moving precious grain and ancestral tablets to the highest ground they can find. Every man in the district knows that tonight, the levee is the only thing that exists in the entire world. The sound of the yellow river in flood is a low, guttural roar that vibrates in the soles of the feet and the marrow of the bones. It is the sound of millions of tons of liquid mountains grinding against the fragile works of man, carrying the weight of a continent in its churn. To the Romans, water was a melodic chime in a marble basin, a sound of peace, health, and civic order. To the Chinese, it is the voice of a predator that has been hunting their bloodline for 3,000 years. When the first seep of water appears at the base of the dike, it is not a mere leak, but a death sentence for the surrounding valley. A single stream of clear water indicates that the river is eating the levee from the inside out, a terrifying process known as piping. Lao Chen shouts a command through the rain, and a dozen men throw themselves into the mud, clutching heavy bundles of kaoliang stalks and straw. They do not hesitate for a second, for to hesitate is to allow the river to widen the gap into an unstoppable chasm. This is the essence of the Chinese struggle, the total and absolute subordination of the self to the needs of the collective. In Rome, the law protected the individual's right to access water, but in China, the law demanded the individual's life to control it. There is no concept of a private life when the river rises, for the water does not distinguish between the rich man's villa and the poor man's hut. Survival is a binary state, achieved only through the perfect, selfless synchronization of every hand in the province. The engineers of the imperial court had perfected a technique of sacrifice that was as mathematically efficient as it was heartless. When a levee threatened to burst near a major administrative center or a vital grain depot, the order was often given to intentionally breach a dike upstream. This would flood the smaller, less populated farming villages to relieve the pressure on the great cities and the seat of government. It was a cold, calculated trade, sacrificing the few to ensure the continuity of the civilization as a whole. Lao Chen knows that his village might be the one chosen for this silent, state-mandated execution. He watches the horizon for the signal fires of the imperial messengers, wondering if the order has already been signed in a distant, dry palace. There is no anger in this thought, only a grim, ancestral acceptance of the price that must be paid for the survival of the land. To be a part of this civilization is to understand that the soil is soaked in the blood of those who held the line. The physical toll of this battle is etched into the very landscape of the North China Plain, which has been reshaped by human hands over millennia. Thousands of miles of secondary dikes and diversion channels crisscross the earth like the veins of a giant struggling to breathe. Each one represents 1,000,000 hours of human toil, a monument to the fact that here, nature is never truly conquered or tamed. It is only negotiated with through a currency of endless, back-breaking labor and the occasional offering of a village to the waves. In the Roman world, technology was a tool to enhance the human experience, a way to make life more comfortable, graceful, and urban. The aqueduct was a triumph of the intellect, a geometric proof written in stone and gravity for the benefit of the citizen. In China, technology was a weapon of desperation, a crude but massive shield held up against a falling sky to protect the subject. The focus was not on the elegance of the arch or the purity of the flow, but on the sheer density of the rammed earth. As the night deepens, the men on the levee work by the flickering light of oil torches that hiss in the driving rain. They form human chains to pass heavy stones and baskets of dirt, their bodies slick with a mixture of sweat and yellow silt. If a man falls from exhaustion, he is pulled up by his neighbor without a word, the rhythm of the work never breaking for a moment. This is the hydraulic state in its purest form, a living, breathing machine made of flesh and bone, driven by the instinct of the hive. The sacrifice for the collective good extended far beyond the physical labor of the peasantry and the farmers. Local magistrates were held personally responsible for the integrity of the dikes in their jurisdiction with their very lives. If a major breach occurred under their watch, the punishment was often swift, public, and terminal, regardless of the severity of the storm. Many officials, faced with an unstoppable flood, would choose to drown themselves in the very waters they failed to contain as a final act of accountability. This culture of total, crushing responsibility created a society that was uniquely resilient to even the most catastrophic events. When the floodwaters finally receded, leaving behind a wasteland of stinking mud and ruins, the survivors did not scatter or abandon the land. They returned to the same silt-covered fields, rebuilt their homes from the earth itself, and began the work of raising the levees even higher. This cycle of destruction and rebirth forged a national identity defined by its ability to endure the unendurable without breaking. We must contrast this with the Roman approach to disaster, which often relied on the state's ability to provide relief and resources from the center. When a Roman city was hit by a drought or a broken aqueduct, the citizens looked to the emperor to fix the infrastructure and restore their comfort. In China, the people were the infrastructure, a decentralized but unified force that operated under a central command to preserve the existence of the race. The Roman was a consumer of the state's power, while the Chinese was the very fuel that powered it. The moral weight of this sacrifice was codified in the rituals of the state, where the emperor would pray to the river gods for mercy and restraint. These were not mere superstitions, but vital political theater designed to reinforce the social contract between the ruler and the ruled. The emperor acknowledged that his right to power was contingent on his ability to organize the defense of the land against the water. If the river won, it was a sign that the emperor had failed his most sacred duty to the collective soul of the people. The rain begins to slacken as a gray, watery dawn breaks over the swollen river, revealing a landscape that has been transformed into a shallow, yellow sea. Lao Chen and his men stand exhausted on the crest of the levee, their village saved for another season by the narrowest and most painful of margins. They have survived, but they can see that the river has grown even higher, its silt filling the channel and preparing the ground for an even greater confrontation. The battle for survival had been won tonight, but the fundamental flaw of the hydraulic state was beginning to show its deep structural cracks. A new kind of power was emerging from this mud, one that would soon challenge the very foundations of the imperial order. Chapter 8: Individualized Technology versus National Mobilization. In the quiet of a Roman villa, a specialized engineer known as a liberator unrolls a sheet of parchment. He is not a soldier or a priest, but a master of slopes, a man who spends his life chasing a gradient of a few inches over several miles. Using his specialized surveying instruments, he dictates the path of a mountain stream with the cold logic of geometry. This is the Roman approach to the world, the application of individualized, elite technology to solve the problems of the city. The Roman aqueduct was never a product of mass, unthinking labor, but a feat of highly specialized craftsmanship. While slaves provided the raw muscle for the heavy lifting, the integrity of the structure rested on the shoulders of a small class of professional architects and stonemasons. These men were often celebrated as individuals, their names etched into the records of the state as the masters of the elements. They did not rely on the sheer weight of a million bodies, but on the mathematical perfection of the arch and the chemical secrets of volcanic cement. This focus on individualized technology created a system where water was treated as a sophisticated service for the urban citizen. The engineering was designed to be invisible, a silent miracle that delivered the luxury of a mountain spring directly into the heart of a crowded metropolis. A Roman did not need to understand the river or the rain to enjoy his bath. He only needed to trust in the expertise of the engineer. The technology was a bridge between the wild power of nature and the refined comfort of the individual. Across the world, on the banks of the Yellow River, the concept of the individual engineer vanishes into the roar of the crowd. Here, the challenge of the water is so immense that no single mind, no matter how brilliant, can hope to solve it with a clever arch or a stone pipe. The Chinese response to nature is not the precision of the architect, but the absolute mobilization of the entire nation. It is a technology of human mass, where the primary building block is not the stone, but the disciplined body of the subject. When the imperial drums sound to announce a new project on the levees, it is not a call for specialists, but a summons for the collective. Hundreds of thousands of farmers are transformed overnight into a singular living machine that moves across the landscape like a force of nature itself. They do not use the Roman chorobates to find a perfect slope. They used the simple weight of their numbers to raise the earth against the tide. This is mobilization on a scale that would have been unrecognizable to the Roman Senate. The logistics required to sustain this human machine were the true engineering marvel of the Chinese state. To keep 500,000 men working on a single stretch of the river, the empire had to manage a flow of grain and supplies that spanned thousands of miles. This was not the engineering of water, but the engineering of society, molding the very structure of the economy to support the battle against the river. The individual was not a consumer of a service, but a component in a vast national defense system. In Rome, the technology of water was increasingly individualized through the use of the fistula, the lead pipe that carried water into private homes. Wealthy citizens would pay for a specific grant of water, their names stamped into the metal to signify their personal ownership of a piece of the public bounty. This created a culture of private luxury, where a man's status was measured by the volume of the spring he could command for his own gardens. The aqueduct was a public triumph that served private desires. In China, such a concept of private water management was not only impossible, but viewed as a threat to the survival of the state. The water did not belong to the individual, and the individual did not have the right to negotiate with the river. Every drop of water and every inch of the levee was a matter of national security, managed by a central bureaucracy that tolerated no private interference. The technology of the levee was a collective shield, and its maintenance was a burden that every soul was required to share. The Roman engineer worked with materials that were meant to last for eternity, believing that a well-built arch could defy time itself. He sought to create a static, permanent victory over the landscape, a monument to human reason that would stand long after he was gone. This was the technology of the monument, where the physical structure was the primary achievement. If the aqueduct stood, the engineer had succeeded in his individualized mission to civilize the wilderness. The Chinese administrator, however, understood that his work was never permanent and never finished. He did not build monuments. He managed a process that required constant, daily mobilization to prevent a total collapse. The technology was not in the earthwork itself, which could be washed away in a single night of fury, but in the state's ability to rebuild it immediately. The victory was not in the stone, but in the resilience of the social order that could provide an endless supply of labor. This divergence created two entirely different forms of human greatness. The Roman greatness was the greatness of the mind, the ability to calculate the pressure of a siphon or the weight of a dome to create a world of urban grace. It was a civilization that celebrated the genius of the individual who could bend the laws of physics to his will. In the shadow of the aqueduct, the Roman felt like a master of the world because his technology had tamed the chaos of the wild. The Chinese greatness was the greatness of the will, the ability of 1 billion hands to act as one to hold back the weight of a falling sky. It was a civilization that celebrated the endurance of the collective, the power of a people who could be hammered by disaster and still return to the mud to rebuild. In the presence of the Yellow River, the Chinese subject felt like part of an immortal organism that could survive any storm. The technology was not a tool for comfort, but a harness for the survival of the race. The Roman system eventually began to suffer from the very individualized nature of its success. As the empire grew, the cost of maintaining the specialized stone structures became a burden that local cities could no longer afford. When the class of professional engineers began to thin and the private wealth of the citizens declined, the aqueducts began to crumble into the ruins we see today. The technology was too brittle, too dependent on a high level of specialized knowledge and a stable, wealthy urban class. In contrast, the Chinese system of national mobilization proved to be incredibly durable over the millennia. Because it relied on the basic labor of the peasantry rather than specialized stone cutting, It could be resurrected by every new dynasty that took the throne. The state might fall, and the river might break, but the system of mass mobilization was always there, waiting to be reactivated by the next emperor. It was a technology of survival that was as deep and as ancient as the Loess soil itself. One civilization sought to elevate the human experience through the precision of the arch and the luxury of the bath. The other sought to preserve human existence through the power of the crowd and the height of the earthen wall. These were not just different ways of building, they were different ways of being, two paths that led to the same destination of imperial power. But as the centuries passed, the true cost of these engineering philosophies began to emerge in the character of the people they served. The Roman citizen was a customer of the state, his loyalty bought with the steady flow of mountain water and the warmth of the public baths. The Chinese subject was a servant of the state, his life defined by the rhythmic beat of the drum on the riverbank and the shared burden of the levee. One was invited to enjoy the fruits of nature's defeat, while the other was commanded to stand on the front lines of the war. The philosophy of the arch and the philosophy of the earthwork were about to face their greatest test as the world changed around them. The water was no longer just a resource or a threat. It was becoming a mirror reflecting the fundamental strengths and fatal weaknesses of two giant empires. The foundations of the ancient world were shifting, and the very technology that had built these civilizations was now threatening to pull them apart. Chapter 9. Divergent Philosophies. Amenities against Adversity. The Roman mind viewed the world as a vast puzzle to be solved for the benefit of the human spirit. For them, the wildness of the landscape was not a sacred entity, but a raw material waiting for the civilizing touch of the law and the stone arch. Water was not merely a liquid to be drank, but a medium through which the very concept of being Roman was expressed to the world. To control a mountain spring and lead it into the heart of a city was to prove that the intellect of man was superior to the chaos of the wilderness. In the heart of the forum, the constant chime of falling water was the sound of the state's promise to its people. This was the philosophy of amenities, where the greatness of a civilization was measured by the quality of life it provided to its urban dwellers. Nature was a servant, brought to heel by the sheer force of Roman will and the elegance of their mathematics. The citizen did not fear the water. They celebrated it as a birthright that separated them from the unwashed barbarians beyond the frontier. To the east, the Chinese soul looked upon the Yellow River not as a servant, but as a relentless and unpredictable deity that demanded constant appeasement. Here, the philosophy was one of adversity, a belief that the very existence of the people depended on a perpetual state of war with the environment. There was no room for the luxury of leisure when the silt was rising and the earthen banks were trembling under the weight of a flood. The river was a teacher of discipline, a harsh master that reminded every generation that survival was never guaranteed. The mandate of heaven was not a static grant of power, but a dynamic and terrifying responsibility to maintain the balance between man and the elements. If the river broke its banks and drowned the provinces, it was interpreted as a sign that the moral order of the universe had been corrupted. Survival was the only amenity that truly mattered in this landscape, and it was a gift earned through the collective sweat of the nation. This created a culture where the individual was a small, replaceable part of a vast historical lineage committed to holding the line. In Rome, the public bathhouse, or thermae, became the ultimate expression of this philosophy of comfort. It was a space where the richest senator and the poorest laborer could soak in the same heated waters, surrounded by marble statues and intricate mosaics. This was the democratization of luxury, a way to bind the diverse population of the empire together through a shared experience of physical well-being. The aqueduct was the silent engine that made this social cohesion possible, pumping millions of gallons into the city every single day. The Roman citizen felt a sense of mastery over their surroundings because their technology had rendered the struggle for water invisible. They did not have to worry about the source of the flow or the maintenance of the pipes. They simply turned a valve and expected the bounty of the mountains to appear. This created a psychological distance between the urban population and the natural world that sustained them. The environment was something to be enjoyed and consumed, a backdrop for the drama of Roman political and social life. Contrast this with the Chinese experience, where the environment was a constant, looming presence in the mind of every subject. The philosophy of adversity meant that every man, woman, and child understood the mechanics of the river that threatened their home. They lived in a state of high alert, their ears tuned to the sound of the wind and the rhythm of the rains. There was no invisibility in their technology. The dikes were massive, visible reminders of the ongoing struggle and the price of failure. This divergence in philosophy led to two very different definitions of what it meant to be a member of a community. For the Roman, community was built on the shared consumption of public services and the protection of individual rights under the law. The state was a provider of amenities, and the citizen was a client who expected the infrastructure to function without their direct intervention. It was a society held together by the allure of the good life and the efficiency of the professional class. For the Chinese, community was forged in the fires of shared labor and the mutual defense against a common, non-human enemy. The state was not a provider of luxury, but a commander of resources, and the subject was a soldier in the eternal war against the flood. This created a society held together by the necessity of cooperation and the deep-seated fear of collective destruction. The bond between the people was not found in the warmth of a bath, but in the grip of a shovel on a rainy night. The Roman approach to nature was essentially aesthetic and functional, seeking to create a world that was both beautiful and convenient. In contrast, the Chinese approach was essentially moral and existential, seeking to create a world that could endure the inevitable cycles of catastrophe. The Roman focus on amenities eventually created a vulnerability that the empire could not overcome when the climate began to shift. As the rains failed and the mountain springs dried up, the complex urban system that relied on constant water began to collapse. The citizens, who had grown accustomed to the state providing for their comfort, were ill-equipped to deal with the sudden return of harsh, natural adversity. The very technology that had made them great had also made them fragile, dependent on a level of stability that the world could no longer provide. In China, the philosophy of adversity had prepared the people for the long game of history. Because they had never known a world without the threat of the river, they were not surprised when the floods returned or the dynasties fell. Their social structures were designed to be rebuilt from the mud, and their identity was rooted in the act of survival itself. They did not look to the state for comfort, but for the organization required to face the next storm, making them incredibly resilient to the shocks of time. This difference is most clearly seen in how the two civilizations handled the concept of waste and excess. Rome used its water to flush away the refuse of the city, a practice that was incredibly hygienic, but also profoundly wasteful of a precious resource. The Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome, was the dark twin of the aqueduct, carrying the remains of Roman luxury out into the Tiber. It was a linear system of consumption, where the bounty of nature was taken, used for pleasure, and then discarded as filth. China, by necessity, developed a more circular relationship with the river and the land it nourished. The silt that the river brought down was not just a threat to the levees, it was also the lifeblood of the fields, a source of fertility that had to be managed with extreme care. The waste of the villages was returned to the soil, and the water of the river was diverted into complex irrigation networks that fed millions. It was a system of intense, forced harmony, where every element of the environment was integrated into the survival strategy of the state. The Roman was a master of the moment, creating a spectacular and comfortable present that felt like it could last forever. The Chinese subject was a student of the ages, building a grim and enduring future that accepted the inevitability of suffering. One civilization died when its luxuries were taken away, leaving behind the skeletal remains of its beautiful stone arches. The other survived by embracing the struggle, its levees continuing to grow higher with every passing century, a living monument to the power of the collective will. As we look back at these two giants, we see that the engineering of water was never just about pipes or dikes. It was the physical manifestation of how a people chose to see themselves in relation to the universe. The Roman chose the path of the individual and the amenity, while the Chinese chose the path of the collective and the adversity. These philosophies would go on to shape the political and social destinies of the East and the West for 2,000 years, creating a divide that still echoes in the modern world. But even the most resilient system has a breaking point, and the river was preparing a challenge that no amount of human labor could contain. The true test of the hydraulic state was about to arrive, not from a failure of engineering, but from a failure of the human heart. Chapter 10. Engineering the Future. Lessons from the Ancient World. The stone arches of the Segovia Aqueduct still stand against the Spanish sky, silent sentinels of a world that believed it had finally solved the problem of nature. These skeletal remains are more than just ruins. They are the petrified echoes of an engineering philosophy that prioritized the comfort of the individual citizen above all else. When we look at these monuments today, we see the ghost of a civilization that viewed the environment as a resource to be tapped, channeled, and consumed. The Roman dream was a world where water was a silent servant, an invisible miracle that allowed for the birth of the modern urban soul. Across the vast plains of Eurasia, the legacy of the Yellow River tells a far more visceral and ongoing story of human struggle. There are no graceful arches here to mark the victories of the past, only the rising height of the massive levees that continue to grow with each passing century. The engineering of the Chinese state was never meant to be a finished monument, but a living, breathing process of national defense. It is a testament to a philosophy that views nature not as a resource to be enjoyed, but as a primal force to be negotiated with through the sheer weight of collective sacrifice. These two ancient paths have finally converged in our modern world, creating a global landscape defined by the tension between Roman luxury and Chinese resilience. We live in cities that function like Roman colonies, where we expect water to flow at the turn of a tap, without ever seeing the mountains or the rivers that provide it. Yet we are increasingly forced to adopt the Chinese model of mass mobilization as we face the rising tides of a changing climate. The lessons of the ancient world are no longer just historical curiosities. They are the blueprints for our survival in an era of unprecedented environmental instability. The first and perhaps most vital lesson from the Roman experience is the danger of invisible infrastructure. By rendering the struggle for water invisible to the average citizen, the Roman state inadvertently created a population that was psychologically detached from the natural world. When the aqueducts finally began to fail during the twilight of the empire, the people had lost the ancestral knowledge and the communal will to repair them. They had become consumers of a service rather than guardians of a resource, a shift that made their society incredibly fragile when the center could no longer hold. In our contemporary world, we see this Roman fragility reflected in the crumbling pipes of our aging metropolises and the apathy of a public that takes clean water for granted. We have built a global civilization on the promise of effortless abundance, forgetting that every drop of water is the result of a complex and often violent negotiation with the landscape. When the taps run dry or the reservoirs fail, we react with the same shock and helplessness that the citizens of Rome must have felt as their baths turned cold. The Roman lesson is clear. A society that forgets its foundations is a society that is waiting for its fall. The Chinese legacy offers a different, more haunting lesson about the cost of total mobilization and the power of the collective. The hydraulic state was able to survive for thousands of years because it forged a social contract written in the mud of the riverbanks. Every subject knew that their life was part of a larger whole, and that the survival of the nation required the absolute subordination of the individual to the needs of the dike. This created a culture of incredible resilience, but it also necessitated a level of centralized control that left little room for personal liberty or dissent. As we look at the massive dam projects and flood control systems of the 21st century, we see the ultimate culmination of this Chinese philosophy. We have gained the ability to move mountains and redirect entire rivers, but we have done so by creating bureaucracies of immense and often terrifying power. The lesson of the Yellow River is that while collective mobilization can save a civilization from a flood, it can also drown the individual spirit in the process. We must ask ourselves if the safety provided by the state is worth the price of the total conformity it often demands. The divergence between these two philosophies also reveals a fundamental truth about the relationship between technology and social structure. The Roman choice of the stone arch and the lead pipe led directly to a society of individualized rights and urban sophistication. The Chinese choice of the earthen levee and the mass labor gang led to a society of collective duty and imperial absolutism. Our tools do not just solve our problems, they shape our politics, our ethics, and our very understanding of what it means to be human. Today, we are attempting to build a third path, one that combines the Roman respect for the individual with the Chinese capacity for national action. We are learning that we cannot afford to be mere consumers of nature, nor can we survive as mere cogs in a state machine. The engineering of the future must be a dialogue rather than a conquest, a system that respects the limits of the environment while protecting the dignity of the person. This new philosophy requires us to see our infrastructure not as a silent servant, but as a shared responsibility that connects us to the earth and to each other. The ancient engineers of Rome and China both understood that water was the ultimate arbiter of human destiny. They knew that the way a city manages its flow is the most honest reflection of its true values and its long-term viability. When we look at the dry beds of the Aral Sea or the sinking foundations of Venice, we are seeing the consequences of ignoring these ancient warnings. We are repeating the mistakes of the past on a global scale, treating our planet as a Roman playground while the Chinese flood is already at our gates. The true lesson of the ancient world is that there is no such thing as a permanent victory over nature. The Roman aqueducts were eventually conquered by time and neglect, and the Yellow River continues to find new ways to breach the highest levees. Engineering is not a way to end the struggle with the elements, but a way to participate in it with greater wisdom and humility. We must move beyond the arrogance of the arch and the desperation of the dike to find a more sustainable way of inhabiting this fragile blue marble. We are currently standing at a crossroads that would have been familiar to both the Roman senator and the Chinese magistrate. We have the technology to create a world of unimaginable luxury, but we are also facing environmental challenges that require a level of global cooperation never before seen in human history. The ghosts of the past are watching us, wondering if we will have the foresight to learn from their triumphs and their tragedies. They are reminding us that the water we drink today is the same water that flowed through their pipes and over their banks thousands of years ago. The engineering of the future is not just a matter of better materials or faster computers. It is a matter of the human heart. It is the decision to value the long-term survival of the collective as much as the short-term comfort of the individual. It is the recognition that our levees and our aqueducts are not just structures of stone and dirt, but the physical manifestation of our commitment to the generations that will come after us. If we fail to build with this moral clarity, then our ruins will be no different from those that litter the deserts and the plains of the ancient world. As we conclude this journey through the hydraulic history of our species, we are left with a single, haunting question. Will our descendants look back at our works and see a civilization that found a way to live in harmony with the water? Or will they see another cautionary tale of pride and collapse? The answer is not written in the stars, but in the way we choose to manage the next drop of rain and the next rising tide. We are all engineers of the future, whether we carry a shovel or a smartphone, and the river is waiting for our response. Now is the time to look beyond the convenience of your own tap and the safety of your own walls. We must demand a new era of transparent, sustainable, and equitable resource management that honors the lessons of those who came before us. Educate yourself on the sources of your water, the integrity of your local infrastructure, and the environmental policies of your leaders. The battle for the future is being fought in the watershed and the boardroom, and your voice is the most powerful tool we have to ensure that the water continues to flow for all. The story of the aqueduct and the levee is far from over. It is merely entering a new and more critical chapter. Let us build not just for the moment, but for the eternity that our ancestors so desperately sought to capture in stone and soil. Join the movement to protect our global water heritage and advocate for engineering solutions that put the planet and its people first. The legacy of the ancient world is in your hands, and the river of history is calling you to act before the next storm breaks.